What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. It's week 14 of the fantasy football season, which means we are in the final push here to make those fantasy football playoffs. Hopefully you guys have already clinched and you're not too worried going into week 14. But if you are, I got my top 36 wide receivers to help you win your matchups here this weekend, hopefully getting you into those fantasy football playoffs. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as always, I got 7 tiers to get through all 36 wide receivers here in today's episode, working our way from the elite wide receiver 1s all the way down to the low-end wide receiver 3s. As always, the label of the tier is how I am viewing these players if we are plugging them into our lineups here in this week's slate. So let's start it off in the top tier. I only have 2 guys in the elite wide receiver 1s. It is Jaxon, Smith-Njigba, and CeeDee Lamb. JSN, we don't need to talk too much about it. He has been elite all year round. But CeeDee Lamb, he's a player that I want to talk about because the matchup is very good for him here this week. He plays Thursday Night Football at the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are a good matchup for wide receivers because they are ranked 31st against the wide receiver position, giving up 5.8 fantasy points above the expectation. So CeeDee Lamb should be in store for a big game. It should trickle down to George Pickens as well, and we will talk about him here shortly because we're going to move on to tier 2 here, where I have the high-end wide receiver 1s, and 4 players are in this tier with Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua, Rashee Rice, and George Pickens. So like I said, that good matchup is going to trickle down to George Pickens, just like with CeeDee Lamb. They're averaging 5.8 fantasy points above the expectations, so a big day could be in store for both of these Dallas receivers. But on the other end, there are 2 players in this tier that do have bad matchups here this week. For me, that's going to be Rashee Rice, and it's going to be Puka Nacua. Puka plays on the road at the Arizona Cardinals. It is a bad matchup on paper because right now Arizona is ranked 7th against the wide receiver position, giving up 3.1 fantasy points below the expectation. So it's a little bit of a tougher matchup here for the Rams receivers, but Puka Nacua, DeVonta Adams, we haven't been too worried about them all year round. They have been matchup proof. It is just tougher on paper right now, just based off of the Arizona Cardinals defense against the wide receiver position. Now, Rashee also has a tough matchup. He plays Sunday Night Football against the Houston Texans, and right now they're ranked the 4th best against the wide receiver position, giving up 4.5 fantasy points below the expectation. Ever since coming back into the lineup, though, Rashee has been this offense. It maybe is for better or for worse sometimes because the Chiefs haven't really been winning games, but Rashee has been majorly involved in this offense, and he's been great for fantasy football. So a top 5 guy still in my rankings despite the tough matchup here this week. Let's go to tier 3. Tier 3 for me is going to be those low-end wide receiver 1s in week 14. I got a total of 6 players in this tier, working from Nico Collins to Davante Adams, Jameson Williams, Chris Olave, AJ Brown, and Jaylen Waddle to round out this entire tier. 4 matchups I want to talk about. One of them can be the Davante Adams matchup. Like I said, against Arizona is a little bit tougher. Should trickle down to him, but he's been a red zone monster this year. Should still get into the end zone in this one. It's almost like an every single week, anytime touchdown bet is going to cash for Davante Adams at this point. Nico Collins is another player who has a tough matchup here in this tier. He plays on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Right now, they're ranked 6th against the wide receiver position, allowing 3.4 fantasy points below the expectation. So should be a tougher matchup for Nico Collins. But again, he's an elite talent. I'm still not too worried about him, just viewing him more as a low-end wide receiver 1 here this week. The other bad matchup in this tier is going to be AJ Brown, who's on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers. It's Monday Night Football. This is a bad matchup because they are currently ranked top 5 against the wide receiver position, giving up 3.8 fantasy points below the expectation. So AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith will both have tougher matchups here in this game against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, there is a good matchup in this tier, and it's unfortunate because Amon-Ra St. Brown doesn't look like he will play in this one. He is a game time decision, but if I had to guess, they're probably going to hold him out of this one. I'm hoping I'm wrong because I have Amon-Ra in pretty much every league, but Jameson Williams is going to benefit tremendously in this matchup and with the added opportunity if Amon-Ra does miss this game. So he's a top 10 player in my rankings this week. Thursday Night Football. Right now, Dallas is ranked dead last against the wide receiver position, giving up 9.6 fantasy points above the expectation. So Jameson Williams should be in store for a huge day here if Amon-Ra were to miss time. No Sam Laporta, and Isaac Tesla is going to have flex potential, I think, in this game as well. He's not going to make my top 36 wide receivers, but he will have flex potential in this matchup. Let's move on to my tier 4. My tier 4 is going to be those high-end wide receiver 2s. I got a total of 5 guys in this tier, and we're going to start it off with Justin Jefferson, Lad McConkey, DeVonta Smith, Zay Flowers, and Emeka Egbuka to round out this tier. As I said with AJ Brown, the bad matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers on the road, Monday Night Football, top 5 wide receiver defense is going to trickle to DeVonta Smith, so more of a guy that I'm viewing as a wide receiver 2 this week. We'll see how this goes for them, but again, that matchup is going to trickle down to DeVonta Smith as well. You have Justin Jefferson, who does have a good matchup in this tier. He is a player that hasn't met the expectations. He's probably been one of the more disappointing fantasy assets over the last couple of months because of the bad quarterback play and the bad offensive efficiency there in Minnesota. It is a good matchup on paper for him. Right now, Washington is giving up 3.2 fantasy points above the expectation, which is 25th in the NFL. So maybe Justin Jefferson can get it back on track here this week. Hopefully he can. I'm still viewing him as a high-end wide receiver 2, though, just because of the lack of efficiency from this offense. McConkey gets a bad matchup on paper this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. So just like those Eagles receivers, it's going to go on the other side of the ball there for the Chargers receivers as well. Right now, the Eagles are ranked 3rd best against the wide receiver position, giving up 4.8 fantasy points below the expectation. So all around in this game, I could see this one being a little bit more of a run game script than it is a passing game script, and maybe more of a low scoring game than it is high scoring. So we'll see what happens with this game. I'm still viewing McConkey as a high-end wide receiver 2, though. And now the last player in this tier that I think is worth talking about, it's going to be Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers plays against the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is a good matchup on paper because the Steelers are currently ranked 29th against the wide receiver position, giving up 4.6 fantasy points above the expectation. Lamar Jackson hasn't played good football over the last month. I'm hoping he can get it back on track here this week in a matchup that should be positive for a passing game script for the Baltimore Ravens. Moving on to tier 5, for me, that's going to be those low-end wide receiver 2s, and I think this is the biggest tier here in today's video. I got a total of 7 players in this tier, starting it off at wide receiver 18 with Michael Pittman Jr., Khalil Shakir, Michael Wilson, Cortland Sutton, Christian Watson, Jakobi Meyers, and Terry McLaurin to round out this entire tier for me. That's going to take me all the way to the wide receiver 24. So again, these are the low-end wide receiver 2s. There's not a ton of matchups that I think are worth talking about in detail. However, Christian Watson is one of the players that does have a matchup that I think is worth exploiting. He plays the Chicago Bears, who are currently ranked 30th against the wide receiver position right now, giving up 5.8 fantasy points above the expectation. So should be a good matchup for Christian Watson and these Packers wide receivers to get a little bit extra in the fantasy points department here this week against a bad secondary there in Chicago against the wide receivers. Again, like it doesn't have to be a bad secondary in general, but it's just what they've been giving up above or below the expectation. Jakobi Meyers is another player who has a good matchup. He plays against the Indianapolis Colts, who are currently giving up 4.4 fantasy points above the expectation, ranked 28th in the NFL. So Jakobi, who has been pretty solid since getting to the Jacksonville Jaguars, should have a opportunity to keep stacking some stuff on top of his good performances here in the last couple of weeks, and will finish as a top 24 wide receiver in my rankings as we head into the weekend. Terry McLaurin's another player that I think is worth talking about. He had a little bit of a breakout game last week. First game back in the lineup in a while. He has been very disappointing this year from an injury standpoint, but he plays against the Minnesota Vikings on the road in Minnesota here in this one, and that is a bad matchup on paper because the Vikings are currently ranked 2nd best against the wide receiver position, giving up 5.1 fantasy points below the expectation. So this is a tougher matchup for Terry McLaurin and Marcus Mariota, who is going to be under center, I'm assuming, again this weekend. We'll see what happens with Terry, but still just barely hanging on as a low-end wide receiver 2, probably more boom bust if he can get into the end zone. You like it. If he doesn't, you're probably not too happy about the day. Let's go to tier 6. Tier 6 for me is going to be the high-end wide receiver 3s. I do have a total of 6 players in this tier. It is going to be Troy Franklin, Deebo Samuel, Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Rome Odunze, and Brian Thomas Jr. The bad matchup that I talked about with Terry McLaurin just a second ago does apply to Deebo as well. I think with Terry on the football field, it only makes Deebo Samuel's role a little bit less important, so not too excited about Deebo Samuel rest of season, especially when he has some tough matchups like this one here this week on the schedule. You do have a good matchup for DK Metcalf, who's on the road at the Baltimore Ravens, who are currently ranked 26th against the wide receiver position, giving up 3.4 fantasy points above the expectation. So DK, also another player who's been a little bit disappointing, just got an added wide receiver veteran next to him in Adam Thielen. I don't think Adam Thielen's going to play this week, but should be an interesting spot here for DK Metcalf. Hopefully he can get some things back on track. It hasn't been good here with Aaron Rodgers over the last couple of weeks. Brian Thomas Jr. is another player that has a good matchup. We just talked about it with Jakobi Meyers, who's ranked 1 tier above where I have Brian Thomas right now. That Indy matchup, though, it is going to be 4.4 fantasy points above the expectation, so should still be a decent spot here for Brian Thomas Jr. Let's move on to my final tier, tier 7, or the low-end wide receiver 3s. I do have a total of 6 wide receivers in this tier as well. It's going to be Alec Pierce, Romeo Doubs, Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Quentin Johnston, and Jordan Addison just barely sneaking in here, probably because of the matchup. We only have 2 good matchups in this tier. It's going to be Romeo Doubs, who plays against the Chicago Bears. I talked about that with Christian Watson. It will trickle down to Romeo Doubs as well, who does seem to be a little bit of a red zone guy in this offense, does keep finding his way into the end zone. We'll see if Jaden Reed's back in the lineup this week too. That would change a little bit of the Packers wide receiver pecking order, in my opinion, going into the weekend. However, you do have a good matchup for Jordan Addison. Like I said with Justin Jefferson, you play against the Washington Commanders, who are giving up 3.2 fantasy points above the expectation. Should be an opportunity here for Addison to play a little bit better as well. It's going to come down to the play of JJ McCarthy. It has been hot and cold, a little bit more cold than it has been hot with him. So yeah, we'll see what happens with this one. The matchup is good though for him to sneak in as a low-end wide receiver 3, just barely into the top 36. You got Xavier Worthy and Quentin Johnston, who get bad matchups here this week. We talked about those with Rashee Rice, and we talked about those with McConkey. However, I'll just re-reference them again. Xavier Worthy gets the Houston Texans. They're top 4 against the wide receiver, giving up 4.5 fantasy points below the expectation. Worthy's going to be way more boom bust with Rashee in the lineup, but still creeps in as a low-end wide receiver 3. And the same thing can be said for Quentin Johnston. Boom bust in that Eagles matchup here this week on Monday Night Football. They're the 3rd best against the wide receiver position, so I do like McConkey's role much more than I like Quentin Johnston's, but Johnston has that boom bust potential where if he can get into the end zone, you're probably feeling all right about the day, but the matchup is tough for him nonetheless. All right, so there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers right now with the information that we have on Wednesday morning heading into week 14 of the fantasy football season. As always, if you found something today informative, entertaining, and or actionable, do me the favor and hit that like button. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed so you can see all of the other content that comes out on the channel throughout the week. We get injury reports today, some other news that's going to happen throughout the week, so make sure you're staying tuned. We got lots of content for you, so make sure you're subscribed like I said, and go join that free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with those fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.